She never minded having these labels stuck onto her. She would almost play up to it. She would see it as an advantage. Certainly it was not, in her eyes, any kind of disgrace or any kind of difficulty being called the Iron Lady of the Western world, because to her, the Iron Lady of the Western world meant that she was someone who stood up for the liberties and freedoms and the style of democracy that the Western world stood for. And similarly, of course, when she started very serious campaigning in the 79 election campaign, and a lot of people would get out and they would shout Maggie at her. And later elections, Maggie, 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 out, out, out. She never once complained about being known as Maggie. She never stood on her dignity and that kind of thing. If people wanted to call her Maggie because she represented something that they wanted to bring about in the country, then Maggie it would be.
Britain is a country of consensus politics. We mostly mill around in the centre ground. And then every few years we realise as an electorate that it's time for a change. And the prime ministers we then elect are seen to be people who have broken the mould, who have broken the consensus. After governments led by people like Harold Macmillan, Ted Heath, Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, people thought, actually, the unions are out of control. It's time for a change. Along comes Margaret Thatcher. She is the embodiment of change.
Now, these few men are the wreckers in our midst. They're not the massive trade unionists, but there are a few militants who are the wreckers. And I think they do as much damage to the decent name of trade unionism as they do to our economy. They seek to use freedom in order to destroy freedom. They must not succeed.
What was known in those days as collectivism or corporatism, in other words, the state knowing best, the government telling people what to do, the unions telling people what to do. This was her huge message, that she wanted to change all that. And what was going to happen in the country was what you, the voters, want to happen. You're the ones who are going to decide. Now, you must decide whether I'm right when I say that we've got to change direction. And that really struck a chord. And of course, crucially, it struck a chord in the 79 campaign and in the election with the people in the middle. At that election...
Very excited, very aware of the responsibilities. Her Majesty, the Queen, has asked me to form a new administration, and I have accepted. It is, of course, the greatest honour that can come to any citizen in a democracy.
You have to remember that Britain had been through a very difficult period. There had been lots of strikes, a feeling that the country was in decline. I think most people felt that. Not just people like Margaret Thatcher, but her political opponents as well. She came in determined to change all that. The first thing she said after election victory was she was going to bring harmony where there was discord, quoted the words of St. Francis of Assisi.
She realised that people were beginning to think that she was a bit imperious, a bit bossy. After all those appearances on television, when she appeared to be very much sort of in control, you know, perhaps she just thought that I'd better make certain that people know that I'm approaching this with a proper sense of humility.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
And of course, lowering the voice. Where there is discord, may there be harmony. Actually, you know, if you look at the photographs of the time, she was so careful about getting that right that she had it on a little card in her hand. And had she faltered, she'd have simply looked down and she'd have spotted the word, discord or harmony or whatever. She was determined to get that right and go in. Now then, I'm going to set about this. Don't worry. You know, I'm not quite the ogress that people think I am. I'm going to be a good Prime Minister.
Now that the election is over, may we get together and strive to serve and strengthen the country of which we are so proud to be a part.
Her first government was actually not as radical as we now like to think. It was actually quite consensual, quite moderate. She had lots of people known as wets in her initial cabinet. As the years went by, she became a more strident figure herself as she grew in confidence.
What then stands in our way? The prospect of another winter of discontent? I suppose it might. But I prefer to believe that certain lessons have been learned from experience, that we're coming slowly, painfully, to an autumn of understanding, and I hope it will be followed by a winter of common sense.
She was absolutely determined to change this country, to stop the decline as she saw it, to break the power of the trade unions, to give Britain back some of the influence in the world that it had lost in the preceding decade of the 1970s. So she had a very clear vision of what she wanted to do, and she was prepared to be extremely unpopular while doing it.
Each person must have his or her own style. They can't work with anyone else's. Your style is part of your whole approach. I didn't believe that the job of a Prime Minister was just to be chairman of a committee. It's not enough just to collect the voices. Leadership is very important in politics. I chose my way of doing it. The Prime Minister must choose his. You can't step into someone else's personality. You have to develop your own.
She never ever believed, and said so, in consensus politics. She thought that that was where Ted Heath had always gone wrong. The idea that you had to wait until you had everybody on board, no, that wasn't going to be her way. Now, she had to tread very carefully. She couldn't go barging in and saying, this is what you'll do because I said it. But right from the start, she believed that if you were the leader of your party, you had to lead, and that you had to do everything in your power to convince people that the position you were taking was right and bring them round.
Oh, I think she's a person with great stamina, great dedication, great courage, and therefore, to some extent, a crusader. And if you like, somewhat gifted with tunnel vision, because if you're a crusader, you've got an objective and you go for it.
I admire her energy and I admire her determination. But she suffers, I think, even in those particulars, from what Proust called the certainty of the second rate. I don't admire her intellectual method, which is an incapacity for thinking she might be wrong.
Well, it's clear that she was clear-minded, and very often this won't do, or why on earth? Laconic comments like that. I said that during her time as Prime Minister, increasingly people around Whitehall knew exactly what her position was and was likely to be. And you would ask each other at a meeting, how do you think this will play at number 10? Or will we get this past the Prime Minister? Because her views were clear and strong and helpful. One had to argue with them sometimes.
Would you like to order, sir?
Yes, I will have a steak.
How'd you like it?
Oh, raw, please.
And what about the vegetables?
Oh, they'll have the same as me.
That would be absolutely. She certainly changed in the public perception and in the perception of the media from being this rather sort of, oh gosh, we've got a woman Prime Minister, how cute, to eventually becoming, well, the toughest of all the people in her cabinet by far.
Who wants to be my deputy? So you think I need a deputy, do you? It might not be such a bad idea. Of course I don't need a deputy. That was a joke. Shut up! Now, if I hear any more of you saying that I'm overworking, I shall fire you all and do your jobs myself.
Actually, when you look at the record, Margaret Thatcher was quite good at trimming and changing when the politics varied. She wasn't quite as struck on doing things her way as people like to imagine.
Behind the scenes, she would always take a long time to make up her mind, to argue it out. Almost she would test to destruction any idea that she would have. She would get people in for really argumentative sessions. She would say, well, now you tell me, now what about this? What about that? Now, if I do this, is it possible that such as that would happen? Really, really hammered. Once she'd gone through that process and had come out at the end with a position that she had decided she was going to stick with, then she never wavered from it.
Having a collective discussion is that she would sum up before the discussion started, and those of us wouldn't put up with that, and you then had to learn how to, frankly, take her on.
I think most of Margaret Thatcher's ministers are pretty scared of her, frankly, and the longer she went on, the more scared they became. Those who did speak their mind outside and rather differed with her didn't last long in her cabinet. She wasn't somebody who was always seeking consensus. She said once famously, I may be the only one thinking a certain thing. I think it was over the matter of Europe, which has always been a problem for this country. She said, well, I may be the only one, but I'm right.
We shall not be diverted from our course. To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
I think Margaret Thatcher saw the country as very divided. And actually, she wanted to help people at the bottom get on. She wanted them to be able to buy their own homes. But she also wanted to break the power of the trade unions, who she saw as the reason why the country was in decline, making unreasonable wage demands, strikes and everything else. So she was absolutely determined to change Britain. There's no doubt about that.
A loyal Chancellor in '81, Geoffrey Howe, said, yes, we may be in a recession, but we have got to cut public spending. Now that sounds, doesn't it, really old hat now. But then it was almost revolutionary. The idea that you cut public spending in a recession went against the typical Keynesian ideas that the way out of a recession was to spend your way, to get up big public works programs. Some people still think that's the case. No, but then that was the big issue. And of course she was hugely vilified at the time.
The jeering began as soon as the Prime Minister set foot in one of West Yorkshire's most depressed areas. But she ignored the first group to talk to some of her younger supporters. It was perhaps ironic that while the water workers' dispute reaches a critical stage, Mrs. Thatcher should be visiting a factory where they make baths. Despite the welcome here, more rehearsed opposition followed. The good news about inflation, which Mrs. Thatcher talked about earlier, did not pacify some people at Calderdale. 60 firms closed and 11,000 redundancies, they claimed, since she came to power. The biggest protest was at Bingley, where demonstrators drowned out cheering party workers. After responding to at least one friendly wave, the Prime Minister went in and narrowly missed being splattered by a flour bomb which hit her car. Police couldn't find out who threw it.
There began to be little stories coming out that the Queen was not at all happy about the way things were going.
Margaret Thatcher was quite nervous of the Queen, particularly at first. She was also very anxious about getting it right. I know from Margaret Thatcher's chauffeur that when she would go to have an audience with the Queen at Windsor, they would leave Downing Street so early they had to park in a lay-by near Windsor Castle, often for half an hour, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, so that they could arrive on time. So apprehensive was Margaret Thatcher of getting it right. The Queen, well, it's another Prime Minister. She takes an interest in all that's going on. It's business as usual. So I think the Queen was quite comfortable with Margaret Thatcher, but Margaret Thatcher, I think, was quite conscious that this was the Queen.
Enough little tidbits have come out about it, and I think there was one version of it which says both sides are pretty fearful ahead of these meetings, but I don't think it was Margaret Thatcher who was the fearful one.
It has always been traditional that at the meetings between the Queen and the Prime Minister of the day, that the Prime Minister of the day does most of the talking, the Queen does most of the listening. I would imagine that in Margaret Thatcher's time, in fact I'm pretty sure this is true, even more of the talking was done by the Prime Minister of the day, and even more of the listening had to be done by the Queen.
It's always said that Margaret Thatcher used to go into those audiences of the Queen and curtsy lower in front of the Queen than any other person ever curtsied before her. It was all done. It was a great curtsy before. And I think the Queen doesn't like that. She doesn't. She wants it to be straightforward and honest. And I don't think they ever really hit it off, to be very honest with you.
There is no evidence of this whatsoever. The Queen, I know, would simply not talk about it. Certainly wouldn't talk about it to anybody outside her immediate family. So the Queen, I think, would have been interested to find here is a woman Prime Minister, and I think would have found appealing Margaret Thatcher's go-getting approach to life. And the Queen, though she is above party politics, I think genuinely, is a naturally conservative person with a small c, so that she would have been in sympathy with quite a few of Margaret Thatcher's ideas.
As to what she thought about Margaret Thatcher, you can look at the following things. The moment that she left office, she gave her the Order of Merit, and a few years later she gave her the Order of the Garter. These are two very, very senior, rather different honours. Both of them are in the personal gift of the Queen, and that tells you everything you need to know about what she thought about Margaret Thatcher. Great respect for her.